in from. It's great to have you here for the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast, a great chance that we have on the second Wednesday of each and every month to bring together stewards from across the country to learn from each other and have a chance to rest in stewardship space. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off a little bit of intro here of what the Stewardship Network is for those of you who may be new to us. We are a 501c3 national and international award-winning nonprofit with more than 20 years of history. We serve 30 place-based collaboratives and fiscally sponsored projects across the Great Lakes and East and West coasts of the country. And then we have many other programs that you can learn about on our website at stewardshipnetwork.org. If you are new to the webcast, it happens each and every second Wednesday of the month. We've been doing them for more than 20 years, and many of the programs are available to all of you all. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize you all, nature's caretakers. So in terms of connecting, we bring stewards together to share knowledge, resources, and inspiration, like today or like last night where I was out on Mill Creek looking at a section of undammed creek and how that creek is recovering with 15 curious people, some new to the field and some who've been working in the field for decades. So we bring people together, we equip, we provide, we remove hurdles so that you all can provide more energy into your ecosystems and communities. We mobilize, we amplify and accelerate the impacts of your collaborative stewardship here, both at home where you all are, like Rachel and the invasive species, the PRISM in Buffalo, New York, as well as nationwide. So like I said, we exist to connect. The stewardship, not only are the monthly webcasts one of our favorite ways, but the Stewardship Network's our annual conference is another one of those ways. And that is coming up in January on the 21st and 22nd of next year. Registration's now open and there's early bird rates through October. We will announce the keynotes in the beginning of September, so you can learn more about that. The event takes place in East Lansing, Michigan. The call for abstracts is now open. The deadline for that is October 1st. And again, we love having you all share your knowledge and resources with each other and a chance to really highlight the work that you all do. So all of you online that just shared all of the great work that you are doing in the chat when you introduced yourselves, all of you all would make amazing conference presenters. So I encourage you all to think about presenting. If you are selected, we've got a discounted rate for event registration, and really would encourage you all to submit. We love watching those come in. I want a big shout out to these early sponsors for committing their support early. It's generous, but also wise because we get to shout you out from the very beginning. We encourage you all to visit our site and join these amazing all-stars before our next month's big announcements. As I said, I'm pleased to be here with Rebecca Stanfield McCown. She's the CEO of the YMCA Alliance of Northern New England, and she will be talking today about Stewardship Starts with Community, Insights from Parks, Policy, and Nonprofits. And as Rebecca is presenting, I want to encourage you all to, if you've just popped in after the intro, take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to drop in your comments. There's one of the things that's fabulous about this community is that we're kind of a lively back and forth group. So feel free to add your comments and thoughts in there. Share the questions that you have. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, and encourage you all to interact. Fabulous to be with you. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Lisa. I am really excited to be here with all of you. I'm gonna get started with who I am. I always think it's important to know who you're about to listen to for 45 minutes or so, and what they're going to share. So I am coming and bringing sort of three different lenses of perspective to the work of stewardship. I spent 16 years in the federal government, most of that with the National Park Service, closing that chapter out as director of the Stewardship Institute. I got to spend a year and a half with the White House Council on Environmental Quality as the Director of Environmental Justice Public Engagements. And now I'm with the YMCA Alliance of Northern New England. But I think what is most important about my story is that it starts with that little baby that's being held in front of the tree. That's me, my dad, and my two older siblings. That's about the age I started going to a family camp in Western Pennsylvania with my family. You know, before I could walk, basically. My family started camping, and that's where I fell in love with nature and the outdoors and outdoor recreation, and spent all of my childhood going to that camp, was a camp counselor. My family just got back from that family camp on Saturday, so we still go, and I am now 44 years old. But those experiences, those summer weeks at camp, is what really led me to a career in natural resources. I went to college thinking I was going to be a camp director because that really was my connection to being outside and being in nature. And when I was in school at Colorado State, I fell in love with the National Park Service and the idea of public lands and the purpose of public lands being for all. And how can we help public lands really live up to that ideal? And so made a pivot and went into the federal government. I never thought that I'd find myself working at the White House, but as you connect with people and start working on different projects, I got involved in some environmental justice work that I'll talk about in a little bit. And made some great connections and ended up at the White House Office on Environmental Justice, the first ever White House Office on Environmental Justice, which was just an amazing experience to connect with communities and advocates across the country. And when that opportunity came to an end, I was thinking about what do I want to do? I was back at the Park Service, and thinking about everything I had learned from my time at CEQ, and decided to apply for this job with the YMCA. I didn't know that they had alliances, which are regional type offices that support Ys. So my region is Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And I found myself in this full circle moment where the family camp I went to was run by the Greater Pittsburgh YMCA. I always loved the YMCA. And I found myself at this pivot, at this time of uncertainty, back with an organization that had basically shaped me, had set me on the trajectory for the path that I was going to be on. So I have really spent the last year that I've been in this position reflecting on the similarities and the differences between the different roles I've had across the Park Service, at CEQ, and now with the YMCA. And really how they connect with people and how they connect with what people care about. So when I was invited to do this webcast, I was thinking of what's one really specific topic I can dive into? And what I found really excited me as I was thinking about it was to really reflect on how these different places, these different audiences, these different ways of talking about stewardship, how they align, what they come together to do. So I started thinking about what has been one of my prevailing questions as I've gone through my work. What is it that I am always looking to try to figure out how to answer? And it starts with this: how do we inspire people to care for something that they don't own, but belongs to all of us? That really, from my grad school days, thinking about how do you get people to care for the commons? How do you really instill that sense of stewardship? What it evolved to, as I went through my graduate research, was how do we inspire people to care for something when they've been excluded? My interest in natural resources and diversity really peaked when I was in undergrad, and I was just curious as to why, as a person of color, I was one of few in my classes, and really wanted to dive deeper into that. And the pool of the National Park Service to be something for everybody, to be a resource, an educational tool, a storyteller for everybody, really inspired me to think about all of the communities that should be engaged, that can be engaged. And so how do we go about doing that? So I started thinking about, across my career, and in my new role in a community-based nonprofit, what is stewardship? And it's not something that organizations create. You know, the Park Service is not creating stewardship. It's something that communities are choosing. It's something that people choose to be. And our role is to help create the conditions where people can become those stewards. They can choose that path to stewardship. And if you've been in the field for a little while, you know that the idea of stewardship and conservation has shifted, and how we talk about it has shifted. From experts identifying what the priorities are, agencies making decisions, and that public participation that comes at the end. You have some scoping, you have some surveys, you have some public meetings. And what we're really looking at now in terms of stewardship and how we go about conservation is really working with communities to identify their values. What is it that they're seeking out of their landscapes, out of their geography, out of their community organizations, and that it's our job to listen first. And I'm going to talk a lot about the importance of listening. Solutions are being co-created. The expertise, the knowledge, it's in the communities, it's in the field. So really looking for that lived experience and bringing that into solutions. And that stewardship it's a shared calling. It's a shared passion. So starting out, listening creates legitimacy. So listening isn't that first step of engagement. It really is engagement throughout all types of developing stewards, really creating that fertile ground for stewards. I like to focus on how we go about listening. What does that look like? What does that mean? So if we're looking across the three organizations, I'm going to tee up most of this presentation across the Park Service, my time at CEQ, and then the YMCA. We're thinking about listening not as a box that you check, but as a way that you start to build those relationships, show your intentionality, and be really authentic in your engagement with folks. So in the Park Service, our planning efforts, our work with gateway communities, and bringing in local knowledge to improve park decisions, we would do that through continual listening sessions, community engagement sessions, bringing communities into the decision-making, making sure that we are hearing them first before we're making decisions. So when you think about a park going into a long-range interpretive plan or a management plan, having community engagement that is not just at the beginning and not just at the end, but is baked into the whole process. When we did this at Marsh Billings Rockefeller several years ago, we were very intentional about bringing different groups into the park, going into other communities to talk about what were the important stories for them, what were the important themes, what was really going to add value to the community that the park would be able to fulfill. When I was at CEQ, the main part of my job was creating a place for people to come so that we could listen to their lived experience and help put that into place in policy. So I felt it was my responsibility to make sure that we had as many meetings, as many opportunities to engage with the public as possible. Because hearing from the community advocates, from the folks in communities talking about the health challenges they were dealing with, the transportation challenges they were dealing with, what solutions they were looking for, was important for us to know as we went back to other federal agencies and were looking at policy to say, how is this really impacting what they shared with us? Is this going to make the change that they're looking to see? What are some changes that we're able to make? And then for the YMCA is a community-focused organization. I've learned a lot about their structure over the last year. The YMCA is ground up. These are organizations that are started by the community based on community needs. So as Ys are looking to adapt their programming or their processes, they're really focused on community needs assessments, making sure that they are listening to members, but also folks in the community who aren't members because they might not be getting what they need from the Y, and thinking about how we can incorporate those needs into Y programming. I've spent the past year doing a lot of strategic planning with Ys across the 3 states. And the community-driven piece of the strategic planning really stands out for me as a way in which the Ys are thinking first and foremost, how do we benefit the community? And the way that we figure that out is by listening to them, by going into the community and asking about their needs. The Y might not be able to meet all of them, just like the Park Service isn't able to meet all the needs of communities, but we can serve as a connector, and we can help other organizations and nonprofits and community organizations come together to think about how we serve the needs. But that has to be done by listening to what is really of concern in communities. The next piece is about trusted relationships, and that they matter more than great messaging. It's not about broadcasting, it's about belonging. I, for years and years and years, used the Field of Dreams line of, if you build it, they will come. And that's not actually how it works. Have often said, you can build whatever, but if people don't know about it, don't care about it, don't feel like they were a part in the building it, they're not going to show up. So that idea that if people know, they participate. The first part of my career really focused a lot on the educational tools. We need to get more education out there. We need to make sure that people know what resources are out there. They'll come to the national parks if they have more information. And people aren't going to come if they have a lack of information, but people also have to feel invited in and be invited in by someone that they trust. And I think we all can probably think of examples, we could throw them in the chat, of when you've been invited to do something that you normally wouldn't have done, but because of who invited you, you show up. So the one picture on this screen of the youth in DC in the matching t-shirts, those are youth from Anacostia High School. And this was the second year that we did this environmental justice internship, where the students spent the whole summer with us. They met with different federal agencies to learn about federal jobs. They did interviews in their community about environmental concerns. The first year we did the program, we had, a handful of students. The second year, we about doubled in size, and we had returning students and we had new students because the students invited their friends in. We created a good experience, but we also created an environment where the students wanted to engage with their friends. And so I love using that as an example of, if your friend asks you to do it, you might spend your summer basically doing schoolwork, but cool schoolwork. So I always like to think about who's doing that inviting, who's really reaching out into the communities and doing that engaging. At CEQ, so much of the work was about building that relationship or connecting with someone who had the relationship so that you were able to connect to the community groups. You were able to then get them in to have meetings. And so for groups that had distrust of the government, had been burned by the government before, had felt like they weren't being listened to or were being listened to and nothing was happening, being able to go to them as a trusted partner based on the work that so many folks in the office had done for years building those relationships, allowed us to invite people in and have some really meaningful conversations about how policy is and is not working for communities. Participation must be meaningful. So you need that person that's inviting you in, but much like listening, that if you just listen and never ever do anything with it, participation has to create ownership, has to create meaning and belonging. So we're all familiar with public comment periods that are 30 days, 60 days. Get those thoughts in. Super important for us to be able to make our voices heard. but not always the most engaging or the most personally meaningful for someone. Really important in rulemaking and policy, less of a connection for me feeling like I have ownership of something. One-time listening sessions. We do a lot of listening sessions across all three of those organizations. The key is it a one-off thing? Are you coming back and listening to the community? Are you following up on what you've heard in those listening sessions? And then the survey fatigue, the surveys where the results go who knows where, thinking about how many times you're going to ask the same questions of people. And in my park service career, it's happened a lot that we have engaged with a community a couple of years ago, had a listening session, did some surveys, and then projects stall out for really legitimate reasons. But you have to acknowledge that when you go back into that same community to engage again, because that engagement has to be meaningful. And when it's not in the beginning, you're digging yourself a bit of a hole. So when we start thinking about meaningful participation, it is that building those long-term relationships through volunteer opportunities, citizen science, youth leadership program, community advisory groups, really thinking about how do you create a ladder of engagement and make folks continue to come. One of the concepts that I've really been digging into over the last year is the idea of mattering. Is in the YMCA, we talk a lot about you're not just showing up and doing an activity, but you really matter to the community. And when you don't show up, the community misses out on something. And so really thinking about how we translate that into our stewardship work, that you showing up here today to listen to this presentation, to engage in some discussion and ask questions afterwards matters, because your perspective, your experiences that you bring to the conversation matter, and we're all missing something if you're not here to bring that. And so how do we incorporate that concept of mattering into more of our work? For the centennial of the National Park Service, we had Urban Fellows, which was a 2-year commitment to really thinking about how do we develop some of those long-term relationships in communities and really think about how the park, the community, and local government can work together and create a relationship where each of us are bringing something important to the table, creating a sense of mattering and belonging among the group. For CEQ, a lot of times that focus on mattering was creating the space for people to bring themselves to whatever the meeting was, the engagement was, so that they were able to express themselves in a meaningful way, as well as share their lived experience. So finding those ways to make the connections to show that you being here makes a difference for all of us. So from the beginning, that idea that people become stewards when they have ownership, and it's when they feel that responsibility for something. So CEQ, we saw it all the time. People feel responsible for their communities. They feel responsible for the people in their communities. The number of times that folks would challenge us on policy, on how fast or slow we were responding to things, and emphasizing that they're standing 10 toes down for their community. That's why they're there. That is ownership. That is stewardship. That's what we see in the YMCA with community members really showing up, volunteering, put in the time. Ys are run by volunteer boards who put in a ton of time and a ton of effort to make sure that that Y is meeting the needs of the community. And so you really have to have that sense of responsibility, that sense of ownership. And I like to think about that in terms of you get build in, not buy in. So instead of saying, okay, we're going to shop this idea around, we're going to come up with this program, and then we'll see if some community members can get behind it and can have some buy-in. I always like to think about build and how do they build the program with us. For the Park Service, when I was doing my PhD research eons ago at this point, I was looking at programs that were successfully engaging youth in their communities. And the programs that were most successful were built by the community and were then supported and brought into the Park Service. And so really thinking about how you identify what the value is that the community is looking for and how you support that. So programs like the SAMO Youth Program, or there was a soccer program out in Santa Monica as well that was doing junior ranger programs with some youth soccer leagues. Really looking at how do you start to build that connection, but having the community start building it for you, because that's when they're going to have that real responsibility. I have thought a lot about the small moments that really build stewardship. Thinking back to that picture of me as a baby, all the points along my life that have led me to be a steward, to want to be in the conservation field, to now be thinking about community stewardship and community and building those strong, sustainable communities, and thinking about those small experiences that stack, that create that strong connection. So you're not going to become a steward after one event. The same way we think about engagement having like a one-off listening session. That doesn't create ownership. That doesn't create responsibility. It's not going to create a lifelong steward. What we are really looking for is building on those events. In the Park Service, we used to talk about play, learn, serve, work as the continuum. Like as a kid, you play, then you volunteer, or you have some educational programs, then you volunteer, and then you work. So really thinking about how you take one-day opportunities and then turn them into longer-term engagements. So you come into a Y and you do a fitness class, and hopefully the front desk person or the instructor afterwards asks you, what class are you going to do next? Here's another opportunity to get involved. You do a junior ranger program at the park, and hopefully they say, here are other ways to engage. The Y also has a youth and government program. That's one of these pictures here of the young people around the table in one of the state house rooms in Maine, I believe it is, that creates like stacks engagement around state government and civics. So really thinking about how you invite people back, how you are continually following up. So at CEQ, we would, bring people in for meetings. The follow-up was the most important part, because it's really easy to say, thank you for spending, an hour with us, for sharing your experience. We'll take this knowledge back. But following up and checking in and seeing how folks are doing, what other things might have come up, and continually doing that was one way that these people are already stewards, are already advocates, but to demonstrate our commitment to their stewardship. And as we're thinking about growing stewards, you really want to be able to say, I've had multiple connections with someone. I've been able to engage with someone multiple times, and that's what brings them back. I don't think one summer at summer camp would have made me a steward or gone into the conservation field, but 15 summers at summer camp sure did. And so thinking about how we connect those, how we stack those. We are in a really, really challenging time. My switch from federal government to nonprofit was done out of a bit of distress and thinking about how I wanted to make sure I was having impact. And so thinking about all of the challenges that we're facing, Lisa and I were chatting before the webcast started about similar challenges across the conservation field and sort of the YMCA community organization field. And those challenges of climate change, declining civic trust, political polarization, limited budgets, increasing expectations. Those are things that aren't going to be going away anytime soon. We talk about federal funding and the shifting in federal funding priorities and how philanthropy and other organizations need to step up to fill those gaps and fill the support that communities are looking for, that environmental justice communities are looking for, that conservation communities are looking for. And what I really think is important is that with so much change happening and something new in the news every day, we really need to go back to some of these core principles of how you create a strong steward in terms of listening, developing relationships, building trust, building things together. So I think that's how we're going to overcome that. Way easier said than done, but some of these basic principles of how we work together and really focusing those in our work. So really thinking about how, as a community, you create a larger tent for people to come together in stewardship, how you create more opportunities for people to see how their work in their local community can have impact. So I like to focus on that as sort of that uplifting piece that communities are really stepping up. When I left CEQ and we were very stressed about federal funding and federal support for a lot of efforts, the community organizations, they kept doing the work. There are states that are doing tremendous things around environmental policy and community organizations that are going harder than ever before. And they're doing that through relying on those relationships, relying on the trust that they have with each other, some really hard work, but that ownership that they have, stewardship that they have to their communities and to their efforts. So I like to bring it back to these really simple foundations of, how are you listening? How are we coming together and really hearing each other and what those needs are? How whatever organization you're in might be best positioned to meet those needs or connect people to organizations that are. Across my career, a lot of my focus has been on, where I am right now is not the place that can meet that need, but I know who can, or I know the organization or the agency or the group that can assist you. So let me walk you over there and give you that support. And creating that build-in, as I said. So in thinking across those kind of three areas and how we talk about protecting places and stories, building policy and strengthening communities, what engagement looks like, who we're trying to engage, how we're trying to engage them, and the people that are doing some of that work. I really think that those main ideas of stewardship is relational. It's, at Marsh Billings, Rockefeller, we would talk about steward comes from to take care of the house, to take care of the place where people live. So it is about those relationships. Listening builds trust if you follow through on it. You can't just listen once. You have to be listening all the time. And you have to be able to take action or say why you couldn't do something. And then that meaningful participation that shows that you matter and you belong and you have the ability to influence decision-making, that's what creates ownership and stewardship. And so I have found in my reflection since I transitioned to the YMCA, there are so many similarities, because whether you're talking about an ecological community, a large landscape and all that it encompasses, or a community in rural Maine and how the Y supports that community, so much of the way you bring people in is the same. So much of the way that you create relationships so that you're building common stewardship and common responsibility remains the same. And I think that's where I found a lot of inspiration in my work and being able to support things like there's a picture of the YMCA veggie van, being able to support, food, being able to get food out to community members, connecting folks in communities with healthy resources, getting them outside to exercise, brings me back to some of the original reasons why I went into natural resources and outdoor recreation was to get people to engage, to get people out together, building that community in places that created restoration, that really, spoke to what I saw as beauty. And this sort of full circle moment has really allowed me to come back to those key moments. I'm just going to end on this one piece in terms of like a management plan doesn't do it alone. I think I've said this enough now that people need to feel like they matter. They need to feel like they belong. We do that through relationships. We do that through listening, through creating those ladders of engagement so that folks are there multiple times. They get to know you. I had the honor of being with the Park Service 10 years ago when we celebrated our centennial, and that felt like a really huge accomplishment to think about an organization that had been around for 100 years, 110 years now. Well, I have the honor of being with the YMCA when it is celebrating its 175th anniversary in the US. It started in London before that. So 175 years of evolving to meet community needs is pretty special. And the Bath Y in Maine is celebrating their 170th. So one of the first Ys in the country. And to think about the change that they have seen in their community, in the world, and that they are continually able to evolve to meet the needs of their community. Because the YMCA is not going to be in business if it's not meeting the needs of the community. There's no backing to make sure that that local Y stays there. If they aren't continually listening to and engaging with their community to understand what they need and how they can deliver it, they won't be there. So 170 years seems pretty impressive for a small nonprofit. And it just really emphasized to me that the landscapes and our geography is so much older than that. So we're here for like a smidge of that time, but how do we take that time and really focus on that connection, that responsibility to ensure that the people that are coming 175 years after that are still able to appreciate and benefit from the work that we have done and the environments that we find ourselves in. So that is what I have for you in terms of my reflections on 17 years of work. Did not include school in that. So feel free to shoot me an email. My email is really easy to remember now because I didn't have them put my last name in it. But yeah, love for questions. I haven't been able to see the chat this whole time, so I'm just going to take these slides down and hope that we can do some questions and have some discussion.
Great, Rebecca, thank you so much. So much of that resonates with the Stewardship Network's approach, and just really creating meaningful experiences. Again, I always have so much appreciation for people who show up here, ask their questions, and engage. And when we first met 4 years ago, I was like, I think I would love to have Rebecca share kind of her reflections because it's so crucial. And at some point afterwards, maybe we can talk about how the Ys have evolved for 175 years. Fascinating to think about what that is. So a couple different thoughts for you as we as you think about creating meaningful listening experiences and really engaging people, how has your approach to that evolved over your 17 years or the ways in which you've seen it in the institutions?
Mm-hmm. So I would say previously, I would say, let's have a big listening session, sort of like a town hall, and let's get, we'll invite everybody. We'll have, a big group and they'll be able to talk to us about what they need. And what I have found to be much more effective um, are the smaller opportunities to engage,
Mhm.
where you can have a deep conversation with someone. So thinking about smaller groups in which there's maybe like 10 or 12 people. And this stuff takes time. It's not easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of investment. Um, but when people are able to share their story and you can ask them questions and they're able to have more of that like deeper one-on-one connection, that's what I have found to be valuable. So at CEQ, we had um, a summit on environmental justice. And as part of the summit, we did breakout sessions in which we had smaller groups and they were topic focused. And that's where the really interesting discussion happened. The summit was energizing and just a joyful moment, but in those smaller groups, people were able to really share their experience, really, challenge each other on what was working in the community, what wasn't working, what policy was needed. And so that sort of model I have found to be what I go back to when I really am trying to figure out what a community needs. We've been using that model a lot in YMCA strategy sessions of, you can think of them as focus groups, but really that opportunity to sit across a table, maybe have some food and really connect with folks.
Yeah, that's great. And Rachel asks a good follow-up question to this, which is, in your experience, what's been the most effective way to follow up or
Mhm.
check in on someone who after an experience?
Mhm.
She says, for example, an email, a newsletter,
Yeah.
phone call.
I
How do you?
always like I always like to get someone on our newsletter list. So if you have a newsletter, I think that's a great way of saying like, first and foremost, make sure you're on our newsletter. So any new things that we have coming out, you'll get. But email or a phone call. I have more recently, I think CEQ helped because we did a lot of phone calls, and in the Y, I find myself on phone calls a lot. Have just found that being able to talk to someone and check in can be really helpful, even if it's just leaving that voicemail, because no one answers the phone for a number they don't know anymore. So
Right.
leaving the voicemail to just be like, just checking in, that was a great conversation. Even if you don't have a real follow-up, I always like to think, a month later, make sure they know that you really appreciated that engagement. You might not have anything yet to say, here's what happened, but to make sure that they know that you're thinking about them.
Yeah, that's great. And then that creates that meaningful relationship also. So the,
Yeah.
the ones that develop over time. In thinking about as people are listening and participating here, one of the challenges of doing that, as you said, is okay, so you're listening to people and you're hearing what they need. And how do you create that change then back in the institutions that you are working on? And as you said, making the change and doing it or telling them why you can't also. Um,
Mhm.
but how was that process?
Mhm.
I know that I hear that resistance to it sometimes from people in some institutions, like, oh, once we engage them. And so,
And you have to think about what you're willing to engage on. What do you have the ability to give up decision making or some control or some power over? I think it can be challenging because we're saying we're going to engage people on every topic. But if someone can't actually influence the outcome of something, then you are listening without the intent of really making a difference. So you really need to be thinking about, and this is very hard in the federal government to be like, what can I give over to someone else to really have influence on? But as you're thinking about how you're trying to make policy work for people on the ground, um, a lot of that is in the regulations and in the rulemaking. So really being open to what are we not seeing about how this is impacting people on the ground? So being open to, I need your lived experience so that I can really understand how decisions that are being made up here and language that's being written up here is actually filtering down to how it plays out on the ground. And so that I felt like was a little easier to square because it's not about necessarily saying, come in and rewrite all this policy. It's about how do we take something and really figure out the mechanisms by which we can make it work for you. Um, and that takes time, and it's not an easy task, but it is one of the main ways that I felt like we were able to help influence things was by saying, here are lived examples of what's happening on the ground. How do we then look at the mechanisms by which we're implementing policy to alleviate these challenges?
That's great. Yeah. Um, you opened with the stewardship. The challenge is how to get people to care for something that they don't own or that they've been excluded from,
Mhm.
which is just, I think, so important to, as I look at all the list of attendees, that the work that all of you all do online out in your communities is so much around that. I mean, it's baked in there. And when we think about the legacy, as you said, the Park Service 100 years and the Y 175 years. And in the beginning, I love going to national parks and looking at interpretive signs and thinking about in the beginning, the history of it was so much around acquisition and exclusion and setting it aside. And then it turns to stewardship and that community engagement. And as you think about watershed councils or land trust or prisms or river groups, what would be 1 to 3 things that you would think that they should or could do differently? In
Mhm.
addition to, I mean, so you've talked about developing meaningful experiences and relationships,
Mhm.
and um, if somebody was going to take a practical piece from this and go implement it tomorrow.
Yeah. One of the things that I find myself coming back to is like you have to meet people where they are, right? So there's a local trail group in my community that gets really frustrated at people who are going and like walking their dogs on the trails in the middle of winter and the post holing the trails. Um, and but they only communicate that through like their listserv, through their channels. And so I think a lot about, the person who's going and walking their dog might not necessarily be in the trail community. They don't know that what they're doing is creating an impact for other users. And to come at it from a place of frustration is not meeting people where they are. And so to come at it as like, how do we reach out to more of the community in a way that encourages them to use the resources in a way that protects it for everybody versus like venting of frustration. So that happens almost every winter. And I'm like, the person who you're mad at's not reading your newsletter. They have no idea. And so really thinking about if you're kind of expanding that offering and trying to bring folks in to be stewards for areas that they're living in, that they care about, or that they're, the gateway community to, or that is connected to their landscape. Where are the places that you don't typically go? Who are the communities that you're not typically reaching out to? And then really like pulling back, where do you start that conversation? Because you're not going to start it with, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You have to think about the bear warnings in national parks. And I can joke, like, I don't know why anybody ever goes hiking in a national park when the first thing you see is like, you will be killed by a bear. Not true. Um, but it's, starting it from a place of we want you to be a part of this resource because it's yours, because it's part of your community. And so how do we invite you in a way that is going to build your ownership of how you recreate in it or how you use it or how you interact with it. So that's a long-winded way of.
No, thank you. That's a kind of exactly the kind of thing that I was after, that kind of really specific example. And Judith asked a great question about what's the skill set or mindset needed by members of the community when the opportunity to connect is presented. And I was thinking this, the same kind of thing. Like it does take a certain outlook that you've shared in order to be able to go into a community and do the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from the community perspective or the folks in the organization, let me think about that.
Go first with the organization, and then we'll come to yep.
Okay. From the organizational perspective, I kind of go to curiosity and that you want to know what is going to bring people in. And you want to know what's valuable to people. So not everything that's valuable to someone aligns directly with your mission, but that curiosity of what folks care about, because I do think there are so many ways to make connections to conservation, to stewardship, to community sustainability, when you understand what someone really cares about, whether it is where their child goes after school, or it's, why my drinking water, I can't drink it, like what is it that people really care about? So that curiosity of really, really understanding that. I think from the community perspective, it really is, how are you going to create a better quality of life? Like what is going to allow myself and my family and our community and the ecosystem that we're in to really thrive? And across those spectrums, whether it's we have natural spaces that we're able to recreate in, we have cultural touch points that really speak to our traditions and who we are. We have places for the elderly to go to connect and get some exercise and socialize with others. Really thinking about, eliciting what makes a high quality of life for a community. And so when you're going to engage a community, if you're able to pull on that, what it is they're looking for, I think people kind of perk up and they're like, oh, I do have, an elderly mother at home that would be fantastic to be able to get her out into a park with some other older folks so that she can talk to people and she can engage. Or my kid really has a hard time in school. If I could get him out on a canoe trip and just like connect and allow that energy to burn off, like what is that value? Which sometimes can be a little human centric, but it's really hard to talk about protecting a place without understanding how someone cares for it, whether it's a place they're never going to go or it's a place in their backyard, but how it creates that value and that quality of life for them.
It's great. It's a piece when I think about you talked about building trusted relationships, and the example that you gave of the first year that you did it, you had this number of people there, but then once those people made the invitation to their friends, that they were more likely. And Erin asks a question a little bit along those lines about how do you go about planning stewardship events when limited contact information is available? So kind of the idea of starting it. Some groups have social media platforms that occasionally have information in them, but we don't have a specific stewardship account that we can reach out from professionally. And so that's the challenge of any moment of starting something, right? Starting something from the beginning is hard.
Yeah, it totally is. And it, like, word of mouth and being consistent. I love to steal someone else's story for this, because there is a run group in Harlem, and the person who started it, she's amazing. And when she started it, she was like, I'm going to run every Tuesday evening at this time at this place. Please join me. No one showed up. She showed up every Tuesday, same time, and eventually like 2 people showed up. Then a couple more. Now Harlem Run has hundreds of people. So that consistency, and it the word of mouth in terms of this is where the relationships matter, right? And someone inviting you in. So your organization needs to do the word of mouth for you to invite in the people in your network that you have. And we run into this in some of the community engagement work in the Y as well. You just send a message out to members saying, hey, we'd love to hear what you think. Come to this like series of sessions. Folks don't show up. If you call them and say, hey, we know that you have a kid in after school or your kid's in swim lessons. We're really looking for, ways that the Y can further support families. Can you come to this? They show up. And so that first effort has to be that personal invite. And then you need to be consistent. And, if you're going to do it monthly, if you're going to do it quarterly, like it just has to happen in a way that folks know it's there.
That's great. I love that story. That's a perfect one. We have many of those stories within the Stewardship Network as well, of those kinds of things that you start there. Rebecca, I could go on and we could talk for a long, 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 long time, but the hour has flown by. I want to thank you so much for joining us, so much for the work that you do in all of those settings. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks so much for taking the time to share it with all of us and our audience. And again, thank you, all of you online who are who have spent the last hour with us. I want to encourage you all to become a regular. You matter. We love having you here. Again, it was so great to see, as I said in the chat, so many old and new friends. Again, second Wednesday of each and every month. You'll find us here in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, consistent. Put it in your calendar. See what we're presenting on. Go ahead and register. We've got all of this coming year's information online. In September, we'll be talking about freshwater mussel monitoring and relocation ahead of the Peninsular Dam removal with Paul Steen from the Huron River Watershed Council. Then we'll be also talking about community-led stewardship and how it works in Toronto with Anna Meng from Toronto Nature Stewards. And then in November, we'll be talking about looking at the Stony Creek Dam removal and stream restoration that took place, and we'll be talking about that. With that, I would like to thank you all for being with us. I hope to see you again at future webcasts. And Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.